So now we're back from the lavender fields and we're in our office so we can take a look at the raw files. And this is the base exposure we're going to work with. It's a little bit bright, but we can make all the necessary adjustments in Adobe Camera Raw just to get it a bit darker. So we're going to darken this field a little bit. And of course, we're going to use something called matching, which we've looked at a couple of times, and bring down the highlights so that we can match the base exposure with our darker exposure. Now, I chose this as my base exposure because it's got pretty much all the information we need. So the field has no underexposed areas. We could actually do quite a lot with this single raw file. Now you'll notice I have a brighter exposure here, and the reason why I have this is because on the base exposure, if you zoom into the foreground here, you'll see there's a little bit of a blur. And this is because a bee flew past as I was shooting. So it looks like there's lens flare, but it's not, it's just a bee. And you can see it doesn't exist in the brighter exposure. So I'm going to match these two exposures and just replace that area from the brighter exposure, just put it into the base exposure there. And the final thing about the base exposure is that this was shot as the sun was still visible, so it has that beautiful light bathing the lavender. The darker exposure, however, was shot much later when the sun had set and we started to get that beautiful color in the clouds. So as you might be able to see, there is a little bit of difference between the brighter exposure and the darker exposure. There's movement between shots. And the camera was standing still the whole time and I was using a shutter release, but it's very possible that the soft soil sank, or maybe even the longer lens that I was using, the 24 to 70mm, maybe that was a little bit heavy and the ball head wasn't tight enough, so it sank down a little bit. So you have to be aware of that when you're shooting a long time frame like this. And of course, this shot's really dark, so we're gonna have to brighten everything up so that it matches the base exposure to some degree and makes the blending a little bit easier. And since there's movement between these shots, we're gonna do what we've done previously, and we're gonna flatten all the exposures because we can't align smart objects. And I'm gonna take you through those steps again so we can come out with a very clean image. And this is our final exposure that we're working with, and this contains the upper sky from the lavender field. So we're basically creating a vertical panorama. Now let's take a look at these exposures in Adobe Camera Raw. So this is our base exposure again, and as you can see, I've darkened it and made lots of adjustments. So this is what it used to look like, and this is what it now looks like. So this is basically getting ready for exposure blending in the full post-processing workflow. Now to do that, I brought the exposure down to -0.35 and brought the highlights down to -7.9, and that's to start the matching process between the two exposures, which we've already looked at a few times. And I brought the shadows down to -8, again, just to darken that foreground, just to make it ready for post-processing. Now with all of the exposures, I selected them all and I set the temperature at 3800 and I gave a tint of around 18 or 19. So this is what it looked like before I changed the temperature, and I think that's just a little bit too warm and we're not taking advantage of those beautiful purples that the lavender field gives us. But at roughly 3800 we do get that. Now I'm still going to add some warmth to the image as we get into the workflow, but right now I just want to get our base colors correct. So here's the brighter exposure that I had, which I'm going to use to clean up the foreground of the base exposure, and I've brought down the exposure significantly to -1.65. And that seems to have matched this exposure to some degree. So hopefully that's going to work okay. And now our darker exposure, we've done a lot to this. We brought up the shadows all the way to 88. We brought the highlights down to -72 and our exposure up to +60. And the reason why we're doing that is because this is what the darker exposure originally looked like. And that's too dark to create a really natural, smooth blend. And this is a big improvement. Now I might just bring the highlights down a little bit more and actually bring the shadows down a tiny bit more too, because we don't want to create too much image degradation. And we'll do that if we stretch the shadows and highlight sliders too much. So I'm just going to bring these down a tiny bit. Now with that done, we can go to our upper sky exposure, and this was really dark, so this is what it looked like originally. And now that I've adjusted it in Adobe Camera Raw, I've raised the exposure to 1.65, but I also brought the highlights down because this area here was a little bit overexposed. Now basically I need this exposure to be roughly matched to this exposure in the sky. We're not going to use the trees from the darkest exposure here. We're just going to start blending in roughly around this point in the sky with this exposure here. And hopefully it'll be a smooth blend. And when I'm ready, I just select all of my exposures and do the usual cleaning process. So I remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. And then I hold down Shift and I open objects. And with our images open, I'll stack them with Instamask. And the first thing I want to do is name our layers. So this is going to be our base exposure here. So I'm going to call it base. We're not going to name this one because it won't be here for very long. This is our darker exposure, so I'm calling it dark. And this is our sky exposure because it's got most of the information in the upper sky. Now, just like we did in a previous video when we couldn't align all of our layers because we were working in smart objects, I'm going to create a pre-mask layer because we're going to have to rasterize all these layers. We're not going to be able to go into Adobe Camera Raw again. So I want to create a layer that will help me build an ideal mask to blend in my darker exposure into my base exposure. So to do that, I'm going to right click on the base and choose New Smart Object via Copy. Then I'm going to call this Pre-Mask. Now I just double click on the thumbnail of that layer and I bring the highlights all the way up and I'm going to bring the shadows down. Now I can press OK. So with that, we've essentially made the sky really bright and the foreground really dark so that we can create a nicely contrasting mask. Now I'm going to select all of these layers and rasterize them because we don't need them as smart objects anymore. And I'm going to order them in the correct order. So I'm going to put the pre-mask right at the bottom, the base on top of that. Then I'm going to put the bright unnamed exposure on top of the base exposure. And then I'm going to put the sky exposure on top. Now, just to begin with, I'm going to take this exposure here, the unnamed one, and I'm going to paint in this area here, just where the bee was flying by. So I do that by creating a black mask. So I hold Option or Alt on a PC and left click on Add Layer Mask. Now I just choose a white paintbrush at 100% opacity. It shouldn't be too big. And then I just paint out that bee. There we go. That's a pretty good blend, I would say. And now I can zoom out and I can right click on this layer because we don't need it anymore, and we can do merge down. So that's merged into our base layer. Now we need to align the layers, but we don't need to include the sky layer in that alignment process. So we're just going to choose these three exposures and make them all visible and go to Edit and Auto Align Layers and OK. So it seems like the Auto Align has done a pretty good job. The exposures are certainly more aligned than they were previously, but I'm going to choose the Zoom tool and I'm going to go right into this area here and have a look at the before and after. So actually there's still a little bit of movement between these exposures. You can see the dark exposure looks a little bit too high. So I'm going to change its blend mode to difference. I'm going to choose the Move tool, click once on this exposure, and then I'm going to move my arrow key down and then maybe to the right. No, that did a worse job. So I'll probably have to move it to the left. Yeah, I think that's as close as we can get to aligning our layers. So if I change the blend mode to normal, let's have a look to see if that's made a big difference. Yeah, that's made a really big difference. That's much more aligned. There will be some difference in the trees because of movement and wind and things like that, but we can still come out with a relatively natural blend. So with that done, we now need to look at blending our exposures. And we've done this before. We just use the pre-mask layer. We make all the other exposures invisible. And if you're an Instamask user, we click on Instamask. We choose Brights 1. And we bring along the midtone slider, just so we don't include any of the lavender fields in the final blend. When that's done, we simply press Select, Black Mask, Brush, Command and H to hide the marching ants, make the darker exposure visible and the base exposure visible. Then we make a larger brush with a white foreground set to 100% opacity, and we just blend in our darker exposure. And we can do that a few times if necessary. Now I'm going to zoom in 100%. So this is what the blend looks like. And it looks pretty smooth to me, very natural. But if we zoom in, let's say to this tree here, to 492%, we can see there's a little bit of dark edging along here and on some of the leaves. So it's okay to bring the opacity of this layer down a little bit just to lessen that edging. Or we can keep the opacity at 100% because we want to keep much of this information in the sky. We can choose our paintbrush with a black brush and put our opacity to around 10% and just start masking out some of the horizon there, just to see if we can get a more natural, smooth transition between the brighter exposure and the darker exposure. So there's the before and after. Now I think that looks much more natural. Now we are going to darken the foreground a little bit more, so if there's any darker edging on the trees, then that'll actually become a lot less noticeable as we go along in the workflow. But before we do that, let's blend in the sky exposure. And we can do that really easily just by choosing the crop tool and bringing up this top bit here, just so we've got some space to work with. Then we choose the move tool, we select our sky layer, and we bring it up and change the blend mode to difference. And now we're roughly matching up the trees, but what we're actually doing is trying to match up the sky. And I think that's actually done a pretty good job. If I just zoom in a little bit more, choose the move tool again, and I'm moving the keys here on the keyboard, and we're just making sure that the sky around here, the clouds, don't have too many white edges. And I think that's actually pretty good. So now if I press Command and 0 or Control and 0 to zoom out, I can hold down Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC and create a black mask on that exposure. Then I can select a white paintbrush, set my opacity to 100%, and I can just start blending in the darker exposure. And that looks great, that looks very natural. Now let's crop it to get rid of the dead space. So I'm going to scroll up and I'm going to crop roughly to where the light in the cloud meets the corner here, just to get that sense of completion, which is something I spoke about in the composition videos. So I'm just cropping in slightly in the edges, and now I'm going to move this one a little bit further to the right, just so we have this center marker right in the middle of this line here. And then when we're finished, we just press OK. Now we have a square crop here, which seems to have condensed the lavender fields and taken away some of their impact. So we can make this a little bit better by creating more of a landscape feel. So I'm going to stretch out this image, and I'll do that by selecting all of the exposures, right-clicking and choosing Link Layers. Then I press Command and T or Control and T on a PC and just drag out the side of the image until it looks nice and stretched but not too fat. And once again, I'm going to take the crop tool and just bring the edges all the way out until that center marker once again is right in line here, and press OK. And I think that's a really good improvement. So now we've got to bring some life to this scene. But before I do that, I'm going to delete the pre-mask because we don't need it anymore. It's just kind of weighing down our workflow a bit. So first thing I'm going to do is just darken and give some contrast to this foreground here. And I've put the levels layer here so that it will only affect the base exposure. If I put it at the top, it would affect all of the exposures. But I just want to affect the base exposure. And I'm just darkening it a little bit more. Now I want to add some extra local contrast to the foreground, just to give the lavender fields more definition. And I'm going to do that by duplicating the base layer, by pressing Command and J or Control and J. And I'm going to call this Detail. Then I'm going to right click on this and convert to Smart Object. Now I'm going to go to Filter and Camera Raw Filter. And I converted it to a smart object because any changes we make in Camera Raw, we can then undo at any time or redo at any time. So it's more of a non-destructive process. Now I'm going to bring the clarity slider right up all the way so that we can give this foreground a huge amount of contrast. And once that's done, I'll just press OK. Now, obviously those changes look terrible in the trees and it's a little bit over the top. So I'm going to create a black mask by holding Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC and left clicking on the mask button. Then I choose a white paintbrush and I just paint in some of the foreground here. Now it doesn't matter too much if we don't paint in the darker areas at the top of the field, because these areas never really got much of the sun as the sun was setting. So naturally, any contrast should be a little bit softer and a little bit darker. Now, just to make sure I haven't gone over the edge here, because this might create some white edging, which is usually what happens with clarity slider, I selected my paintbrush. I have a black foreground, 100% opacity, and I click once on the horizon here. And then I choose the same part, but I hold down Shift and I click again. And this creates a straight line. It actually draws a straight line. Now, if you've never seen that before, let me show you what I mean. I'm going to create a new layer, and let's make my paintbrush white. And then I paint here, hold down Shift, click there, and you see we've created that line. And we can do the same there just to make sure the line's nice and thick. So just to make sure I've masked out this area here, so we're not getting any edging, I'm going to make a slightly bigger brush actually. I'm going to click right on the horizon, hold down Shift just as before, and then I'm going to do it again. And so now we shouldn't have any edging. And now I can paint just over these trees just to make sure the clarity hasn't gone on these trees. We don't really want these trees to be detailed in any way. We're quite happy to have them as kind of a silhouette. Now, why don't we add a little bit more contrast and warmth to the foreground here, where the sun is lighting up the lavender fields. We've already used this technique before. It's a dodge and burn technique. So I'm going to select this top layer. I'm going to go to our actions, and I'm going to go to highlights, D and B, and press play. And now we've created a grayscale mask. We've got to bring along the slider to try and brighten up the highlight slider, to brighten up these parts of the fields here, because this is where we want to affect. So I'm going to bring the midtones along just so we make some contrast there between the brightest parts and the darkest parts of the lavender fields. And I'm just refining the mask a little bit more each time, and move the highlight slider along more and more. Now the midtones a little bit more, and I think that's a good mask. So I'm going to press OK. So with our mask created, I'm going to drag this highlights layer down below the sky. And I'm going to select the layer. And now we want to create a nice warm color. So I'm going to go to something like a beige, maybe this color, just to add a little bit of warmth to the foreground. And press OK. Now I'm going to make a bigger brush. And I'm just going to start painting in the foreground here. And you see we're adding that beautiful warmth to the highlighted areas. And the reason why I put this layer underneath the dark and the sky layer was because if we paint over the horizon by accident, we're not going to affect above the horizon. But let's say if I drag this to the top, well, now you can see we have painted over the horizon. So that's not really what we wanted to do. We want to contain the changes just to the foreground in the lavender fields. Now let's make an overall contrast adjustment. So I'm going to open up a level slider just to give the image a bit more life and kick. And I'm going to bring along the highlights and maybe just bring the midtones down a tiny bit and bring the output levels of the shadows up a tiny bit too. So that's before and after. We're just giving the image a little bit more darkness and mood and emphasizing some of these shadows. Now in the foreground, I still want to give these lavender fields a little bit more light. So I can create another levels layer, and I can just bring the highlights along, and then I can press Command and I or Control and I on a PC, choose my paintbrush. Now I only want to affect the lavender fields, and we can do that with something called a gradient mask. Now next to our paint bucket tool, you'll see underneath that, if we right click, we have a gradient tool. To use this in blending, we can set our foreground to black and our background to white. We select this here. Make sure dither is selected, and then we can click on the black and white thing you saw there. And make sure the top left option is selected, which says foreground to background. And now all I need to do is select around about this tree, hold down Shift so I draw a straight line again, and do a line to around about here. And you'll see by doing that, we've brightened up the foreground, but actually we also brightened up a little bit of the horizon there. If you look very closely, and that isn't what we want. We don't want to affect the horizon. And that's just because I started the line too high. If I start the line here, we can do a smooth transition there to brighten up the foreground and we're not affecting the horizon. Now I think it's time to add a little bit of contrast in the sky because it's not quite dark enough to experience its full potential in terms of mood. But before I do that, actually, I'm going to select this mask, select the paintbrush, set my foreground to black, and I'm just going to paint out the lavender fields right here in the close foreground. I think they're probably a little bit too bright and distracting. So now onto the sky, I'm going to create a curves layer. I'm going to bring it down below this levels layer. I'm going to select the sky and the dark images, press Command and G or Control and G to group them, and I'm going to call it sky. And now with this curves layer, I'm going to clip it to the sky group. And now whatever changes we make, it's only affecting the sky. You see, we're not affecting the foreground. So I'm just going to try and darken the image significantly, because the right hand side here acts as a beautiful vignette and makes us focus primarily on the foreground and the sky. But I don't want the highlights in the sky to be too bright, so I'm going to bring those down just a little bit. And there's the before and after, and it's a very strong effect. And maybe I'll change the blend mode of this to luminosity because the colors were perhaps a little bit strong in that contrast change. So that looks quite good, but I think I'm going to mask out along the horizon a little bit here because I feel like the horizon part of the sky should be a little bit brighter. It shouldn't be so dark. It doesn't look as natural. So if I just mask that out, that looks a lot better. So here's the before and after. Really, we've just darkened the upper part of the sky here, and that in itself is pushing the viewer away from that area and more towards the lavender fields. Now at the minute, I think the lavender fields are lacking a little bit of color. So we're going to do two things to change that. Firstly, I'm going to open up a vibrance layer and I'm going to bring the vibrancy all the way up. And this adds saturation to the softer colors in the scene, and it doesn't affect the stronger, more saturated colors. But I can add just a little bit of saturation there. And clearly I'm going to mask it out from the sky because we shouldn't have this strong purple blue color in here. And I'm going to mask it out just a little bit at around 30% opacity, the area here on the horizon, just because it's a little bit strong. And now the second way we're going to add color is actually through a process called light bleeding. And this is where when you've got a light source out of the frame coming in, you can create what looks like a really strong light effect. And it is especially effective when we have areas like these lavender fields, which have beautifully lit up areas. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to open up a new layer. I'm going to make a bigger brush, set the opacity to 100% for this brush. Then I'm going to choose a really warm color. And it's roughly similar to the color I already used in the foreground here. And now I'm going to paint at 100% around this edge here. And this is kind of acting like as if the sun was just out of the frame, pushing a whole load of light onto the side of the frame. And now I'm going to reduce the opacity of that brush to 50%. And I'm going to do down here just a little bit softer. And then I'm going to reduce the opacity again to 20%, maybe a little bit more. Just a little bit more there. And now I'm going to change the blend mode of this layer to soft light. So here is the before and after, and we've added a huge amount of light and saturation to the field. And I'm going to bring down the opacity of this layer just till it looks a little bit more natural, and that's great. And now I'm just going to see what it's like if I do it again, but just concentrate on this area here. So I'm going to, once again at 100% opacity, just draw down here. And I want to brighten this area up significantly. So I'm going to change it to soft light again, bring down the opacity to around 30%. And I think that looks pretty good. And by using this technique, we are essentially changing the balance of light within the entire scene. Naturally, we already have light coming in through here, touching the lavender fields. But by creating these changes, all of a sudden, our viewer's eyes are pushed straight towards that light source instead of straight down the image. And for me, it's a hugely transformative process. Now I'm going to do just a few more things. And the first of that is just brightening up the scene a little bit more, because this should be a brighter, more impactful scene. Now, naturally, that's going to overexpose the sky in the top left there. So with a black paintbrush, an opacity of 100, I'm just going to mask that out. So now we've brightened up the foreground mainly and some of the horizon, but we haven't overexposed the sky. And I've just noticed one thing because I'm not fully paying attention while recording. And you see there's a line going across here and some slight transparency. That's where I haven't blended the sky, the upper sky, very cleanly. But it's not a big problem because we're using a non-destructive process. I can just go to the mask of the sky there, choose my white paintbrush, and at 100% just paint in that area. And you see we're improving the blend significantly. I should have done that properly earlier on, but I was too busy talking rather than concentrating. So I'm just going to check the rest of the sky, and that looks okay. I don't see any other problems. And zoom out. Now I want to see if I can develop just a little bit more color in the highlights in the sky because they've got a little bit bright. And we can do that if we select the top layer by going to our actions and choosing highlights again and pressing play. Basically, we're going to try and burn our highlights to give them a bit more color. But first we need to select them. So I'm just going to bring these two sliders along just to see if we can make a good selection of the upper highlights here. And I think that seems to be okay. So I'm going to press OK. And I'm going to choose a black paintbrush. It doesn't seem right that a black paintbrush would give our image color, but it certainly is the case when we apply it to our dodge and burn layer. Now, obviously that doesn't look very good. So I'm going to bring down the opacity significantly. And I'm also going to take my black brush, I'm going to select the mask, set the foreground to black, set my opacity to 50%, and I'm going to mask out those changes in areas where we perhaps don't want them as much. And I'm going to do that again because I think it's a little bit strong on the horizon. We really just wanted to add color to these areas among the clouds there. So let's have a look. There's the before and after. And I think that's a good improvement. We're adding a little bit more color and attractiveness to these areas here. And the second last thing I'm going to do is just a quick clone stamp to get rid of these flying insects that you see around the sky. But I'm just going to do a couple of them because it'll take a while to get rid of all of them. And again, like I've said in previous videos, I don't want you to get bored. So I'm going to select just above this insect here and paint over him. And I'll do just above this one here and try that. And that wasn't very effective. So let's try cloning to the left to see if this works. And that doesn't. Or cloning to the right. And that's a little bit better. Now, if we want to brighten up these areas where we have a little bit of dark patches from cloning, all we need to do is select a brighter area, press Alt or Option to select that area, change the opacity to around 50%, and just paint over that area. And if it's a little bit strong, change the opacity down to 30% or 20%, whatever you think is going to look okay. And I'm going to change that to 20%, make it a little bit bigger, and just try painting that along there. And that's still a little bit patchy, so I'm going to change it to 10% and try it here. And that's a lot better. And I know that takes a little bit of a long time. So if you want a quicker process, we can delete this layer, press Command, Option, Shift and E, or Control, Alt, Shift and E, and create a merged layer. And then we can just go to the patch tool, which usually in those situations does a slightly better job. And in this situation, it's done an okay job, but it's left a little bit of a line around it. So let's just try a different area, maybe up here. That's a lot better. And we can try this area here. And that's quicker too. And then there's one there, and we can do that too. So that's a lot quicker, even though it is a more destructive way of doing things. But since it's the end of the workflow, I think we can be forgiven. Now, while we're looking at the sky, we can see there's quite a lot of noise. And like I said before, I don't usually like to apply noise removal to my images because it often reduces beautiful details and textures. But since all of the noise is restricted to the upper part of this sky here, which comes from the upper darker sky image, I think we can apply some noise removal and it won't affect the rest of the image because we'll limit it just to this area. So I'm going to zoom out and again press Command, Option, Shift and E or Control, Alt, Shift and E on a PC to duplicate that layer. Then I'm not going to use Photoshop's noise removal. I'm just going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'm going to zoom in to some part of the sky. And I'm going to go to 0.1 radius, and I'll move it along until the noise disappears. So we're looking roughly at around 5.8 and press OK there. Then I'll simply hold down Option or Alt on a PC and create a black mask and take my paintbrush and a white brush with 100% opacity and just paint in the affected areas. We don't need to go lower than here. And it's okay that we remove any detail because clouds don't necessarily need details, or at least these clouds don't anyway. And so if we zoom into this area, we can see the before and after. So there's the noise and there's the image without the noise. So I'd say that's quite a big improvement. And that is our finished image. So I'm going to select all of our layers and group them just to show you the change that we've made. So here's after and this is before. So we started off with a really flat image, and after making all those adjustments, our final result is extremely colorful, has plenty of details and contrast and no overexposed areas, and it has a naturally pleasing composition.